My son-in-law fraudulently sold my house for $1.8 million. Now you will live in your car. He showed me fake documents. I smiled and drove away. He had no idea that the house he sold was actually... Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always said Tom and I built a good life. I believed them because I had seen the receipts. 38 years of mortgage payments, 2 daughters raised in that house on Sycamore Hill, a garden where the roses came back every April without being asked. When Tom died of a heart attack 6 years ago, the house became the loudest thing in my life. Every room still smelled like him, like sawdust and coffee and Old Spice. I kept his reading chair by the window. I watered his tomatoes. I was 72 years old and I had no intention of going anywhere. My younger daughter, Linz, had married Derek Collins 8 years before all of this happened. I want to be fair to Lindsay because she was my child and I loved her, but fairness requires me to say what was true. She had always needed someone to tell her what to think. In high school, it was her girlfriends. In college, it was a boyfriend who lasted 2 semesters and left without a note. Then came Derek. He was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a tailored suit, always pressed, always fitted, never quite real. He sold commercial real estate in Phoenix, which meant he knew the language of property, the grammar of deeds and titles and closing costs. He spoke it fluently, and he knew that most people didn't understand a word. The first warning sign came 18 months before the day I'm about to describe. Derek started asking questions about the house. Casual questions, the kind you could wave away. What did you pay for it originally, Marjorie? What do you figure it's worth now? I told him what Tom and I had paid in 1986, $94,000, and watched something flicker behind his eyes. I didn't name it then. I should have. 3 months later, he mentioned a property attorney he knew, someone who could help me get my estate in order. I said my estate was perfectly in order, thank you. He smiled the way he always smiled when he thought I was being simple. Then came the visits. Not to see me, I want to be precise about that. Derek began driving out to Sycamore Hill on Saturday mornings, walking the perimeter of the property, standing in the backyard with his phone out. Once I watched him from the kitchen window as he paced off distances along the fence line, tapping something into a notes app. When I opened the back door and asked what he was doing, he said he was thinking about whether I needed a new fence. The old one was perfectly fine. I said so. He said, "Just looking out for you, Marjorie." I went back inside and stood at the sink for a long time, looking at the garden Tom had planted. Lindsay stopped calling as often. When she did call, she sounded rehearsed, like someone reading from a script they hadn't fully memorized. She asked whether I had thought about downsizing. She mentioned a lovely senior community in Scottsdale. I was 72. Not 102, and I had a driver's license and a full set of teeth, and I climbed those porch steps every single day without difficulty. I told her I wasn't interested in Scottsdale. There was a pause on her end of the line that told me everything I needed to know about whose idea Scottsdale had been. The day it happened was a Tuesday in March. Derek called and asked if he could stop by. He said he had some paperwork he wanted to walk me through, something about a property trust that would protect the house from probate. He used enough legal-sounding words that I almost let it slide past me. I said he could come at 2 o'clock. He arrived with a leather folder and Lindsay, who stood near the door like she was trying to be invisible. Derek sat across from me at the kitchen table and laid out a set of documents. He pointed to lines, explained provisions, used the word fiduciary twice. And then he slid the top sheet across to me and said I just needed to sign where he'd highlighted. I looked at the documents for a long time. Then I looked at him. "Derek," I said, "what exactly is this?" He leaned back, and then he told me. Not all of it. Not the $1.8 million. Not the buyer already lined up. Not the closing date 3 weeks away. Just the part he thought would finish me. He said the house had already been put under a contract. He said my signature on these papers would simply confirm the transfer. He said, and I will remember this sentence until the day I die, "You're going to have to be realistic, Marjorie. The sale is done. You'll be comfortable in Scottsdale. Or you can make this difficult and figure out where you're sleeping on your own." He smiled. Lindsay looked at the floor. I looked at the documents one more time. I looked at Derek Collins, who had just told me in my own kitchen in Tom's house that I would be living in my car. And I smiled. "All right," I said, "let me think about it." I picked up my purse, stood up, and walked out the front door. I heard Derek say something to Lindsay behind me, something that had the shape of victory in it. He thought I was defeated. He thought I was an old woman who didn't understand what had just happened to her. He was wrong, because what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, standing there in my kitchen with his leather folder and his borrowed legal vocabulary, was that the house he believed he had just sold had a story he had never bothered to read. And I had read every page of it. I drove to the end of Sycamore Hill and pulled over under the big eucalyptus at the corner, the one the city had been threatening to cut down for years. I turned off the engine. I sat there for probably 20 minutes, and I did not cry. I want to say that clearly. I did not cry. What I did was something colder and quieter. I made an inventory. The house was worth $1.8 million. Derek had said as much, indirectly, by the sheer confidence with which he had moved. A man doesn't hand you fake documents and tell you you'll be sleeping in your car unless the number on the other end of the deal is large enough to make the risk feel worth it. I had lived in that house for 31 years. Tom and I had paid it off in 2004. It was mine outright, free and clear. Title recorded with Maricopa County under the names Thomas Arthur Hayes and Marjorie Ellen Hayes. When Tom died, I had inherited his half without complication. I knew this because I had sat across from our estate attorney, Frank Delgado, in his Tempe office and signed every document myself, with my own hand while understanding what I was signing. So how exactly does a house you own outright get sold without your knowledge? I started thinking through it the way Tom used to think through a broken engine, not in a panic, but methodically, piece by piece. Derek was in commercial real estate. He understood title transfers, escrow processes, how documents move through a system. If he had been planning this for 18 months, and I now believed he had, he'd had time to be careful. The documents he'd shown me in the kitchen were designed to look like a formality, like the last step. But there had to have been earlier steps, earlier papers, earlier signatures. And that was where he had made his mistake. I hadn't signed anything, not in the past year, not anything related to that house. I had signed a new insurance policy in October and a consent form at my dentist's office in January, and that was all. Which meant that if there was a contract, if there was a deed in progress, if there were papers moving through escrow with my name on them, those signatures were not mine. That is called forgery. I knew the word. Tom had been a contractor, and he had once had a subcontractor forge his signature on a materials invoice. He'd taken it to an attorney and recovered every penny. I had sat next to him in that attorney's office 30 years ago, and I had listened, and I had learned. I started the car and drove to Rutt's house. Ruth Gardner had been my neighbor for 24 years. She was 69. recently retired from 30 years as an office administrator at Maricopa County Superior Court. She knew the inside of a courthouse the way some people know their own kitchen. I pulled into her driveway at 4:15 on that Tuesday afternoon, and when she opened the door and saw my face, she said, "Come in and sit down, and I'll put the kettle on, and then you're going to tell me everything." I told her everything. Ruth listened the way good people listen, completely, without interrupting, without reassuring me prematurely. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marjorie, do you still have your original deed?" "In the fireproof box under Tom's side of the bed," I said, "along with the title insurance policy, the payoff letter from the mortgage, and every property tax statement going back to 2001. Ruth nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Now listen to me carefully. You do not call Lindsay. You do not call Derek. You do not acknowledge to either of them that anything is wrong. Can you do that?" I said I could. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "you are going to call the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and ask them to pull up the current record on your property. You want to know if anything has been filed against it in the past 24 months. Liens, transfers, anything. If Derek has been moving paper, the recorder's office will have it." I wrote that down on the back of a grocery receipt from my purse. "And then," Ruth said, "you are going to call a real estate attorney. Not Frank Delgado. He's retired. Someone who handles fraud. I know someone. His name is Stephen Morrow. He's good, Marjorie. He's the kind of attorney who doesn't get rattled." I looked at her across the kitchen table with our tea going cold between us in the ordinary yellow light of a Tuesday evening, and I felt something settle in me. Not calm exactly, not peace. Something harder than that. The kind of stillness that comes right before you decide to fight. "I'll call first thing in the morning," I said. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "He thinks you walked out of there beaten," she said. "I know," I said. "Let him keep thinking that." I drove home to Sycamore Hill as the sun went down behind the ridge. I pulled into my own driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house, the porch Tom had rebuilt in 2009, the roses along the front walk, the window of the room that had been Lindsay's when she was small. I thought about Derek sitting at my kitchen table with his leather folder, so certain of himself, so sure that a 72-year-old woman with a garden and a fireproof box under her bed would simply fold. I went inside, made dinner, and watered Tom's tomatoes. Then I got the fireproof box out from under the bed, sat down at the kitchen table, and began to read every document I owned. By 10 o'clock that night, I had my first plan. I called the Maricopa County Recorder's Office at 8:03 the following morning, the moment their automated system said a representative was available. I had the parcel number for 14 Sycamore Hill written on a notepad in front of me, along with the legal description from my original deed. The woman who answered was patient and efficient. She pulled up the record while I waited. There had been 2 filings against my property in the previous 14 months. The first was a recorded document dated 11 months ago, a special warranty deed purporting to transfer my property into a trust called the Hayes Family Revocable Trust. The grantor on the deed was listed as Marjorie E. Hayes. The trustee of the new trust was listed as Derek L. Collins. The second filing was dated 6 weeks ago, a purchase and sale agreement addendum, filed as a preliminary instrument ahead of a pending escrow close. The buyer was a holding company called Meridian Residential, LLC. The sale price was $1,820,000. My hands were steady when I wrote down those numbers, My voice was steady when I thanked the woman and asked her to hold the records for a possible legal proceeding. She told me I could request certified copies, which I said I would do in person that afternoon. I called Stephen Morrow's office at 8:20. Ruth had already spoken to him. She'd called him the previous evening after I left, which was the most Ruth Gardner thing I had ever heard, and I was grateful for it. His assistant said he could see me at 11. Stephen Morrow's office was in a low brick building in Tempe, the kind of place that communicated competence without theatrics. He was in his mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades sitting across from people in bad situations. He read the documents I had brought, the certified copies from the recorder's office, my original deed, the mortgage payoff letter, without speaking for nearly 10 minutes. When he looked up, he said, "Mrs. Hayes, do you recognize the signature on this special warranty deed?" He turned the page toward me. Someone had signed my name in blue ink. The handwriting had a superficial resemblance to mine, same general slant, same approximate letter height. But it was not mine. The M in Marjorie curved differently. The H in Hayes didn't close at the top the way mine did. I had signed my name tens of thousands of times over 7 decades. I knew what it looked like. "That is not my signature," I said. He nodded as if he had expected exactly this answer. "Then what we're looking at," he said, "is deed fraud through forgery, fraudulent filing with a county recorder, and attempted theft of real property. This is a felony in Arizona under ARS Section 13-2312. Depending on what we find in the escrow documentation, we may also be looking at wire fraud if any electronic transfers were initiated." He asked me several questions. Had I ever given Derek power of attorney? No. Had I ever signed any document that gave him authority over my property? Not knowingly. Had I received any money from any transaction related to the house? None. Did I have any record of what documents Derek had shown me the previous day? I had taken photographs of them with my phone before I left the kitchen. I had done this while appearing to look at them one last time before I stood up. The screen angled down, the camera silent. Stephen Morrow looked at me for a moment with something that might have been professional admiration. "That was smart," he said. "Tom always said read the document twice before you sign it," I said. "But he also said if something looks wrong, start recording." Stephen told me he would file an emergency motion to stop the escrow. A lis pendens, a notice of pending litigation recorded against the property that would legally freeze the sale before it could close. He explained this had to happen before the closing date, which was 19 days away. He also said he would contact the Maricopa County Attorney's Office to report the fraud, and that I should be prepared for this to become a criminal matter, not just a civil one. He asked if I was prepared for that. I thought about Derek at my kitchen table. I thought about Lindsay looking at the floor. "Yes," I said. What I didn't know, as I drove home from Tempe that afternoon with the certified copies in a manila envelope on the passenger seat, was that Derek had already noticed something was wrong. Not because he was clever. He wasn't, not really, beneath the confidence, but because he had called the escrow company that morning to check on a timeline detail, and the escrow officer had mentioned, almost in passing, that there had been an inquiry on the parcel from the recorder's office. Someone had pulled the filing history. He called Lindsay. I learned later that the call lasted 44 minutes. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Sycamore Hill, Derek Collins knew that Marjorie Hayes was not, in fact, beaten. But the lis pendens had already been filed at 2:47 that afternoon. The house wasn't going anywhere. Stephen moved quickly. Within 48 hours of our meeting, the lis pendens was on record. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office had received his formal complaint with supporting documentation, and he had sent a letter by certified mail to Derek L. Collins and to Meridian Residential LLC notifying both parties that the property at 14 Sycamore Hill was the subject of pending litigation alleging deed fraud and forgery. The escrow, Stephen told me, would almost certainly freeze. No title company in Arizona would close a sale with the lis pendens on record and a criminal referral in process. I went about my days as normally as I could manage. I watered the garden. I drove to the grocery store. I had lunch with Ruth on Thursday at the diner on Central, and she watched me eat a full plate of eggs and toast and said, "You look calmer than you have any right to look." I told her that calm was a decision and that I had made it. What I didn't tell her was that at 2 o'clock in the morning, I sometimes lay awake in Tom's house and listened to the silence and wondered whether I had made the decision too late, whether something irreversible had already moved through the machinery of escrow without my knowing. Stephen said we had caught it in time. I tried to believe him. Then, on the Saturday morning after the lis pendens was filed, a car I recognized pulled into my driveway. Derek and Lindsay got out together. This told me something immediately. Derek had decided he needed her there, which meant he was not entirely confident in himself. He rang the bell rather than knocking, which was a formality he had never bothered with before. And when I opened the door, his face had the particular tightness of a man who is very angry and working very hard not to show it. "We need to talk, Marjorie," he said. I stepped onto the porch rather than inviting them in. I sat down in the rocking chair. I did not offer them seats. "Go ahead," I said. What followed was approximately 20 minutes of escalation that I will describe as accurately as I can, because accuracy matters here. Derek began with what I would call controlled aggression. He told me I was making a serious mistake, that the trust arrangement had been designed to protect me, that I had clearly been given some very bad advice. When I said nothing in response to this, he moved to financial pressure. He said the buyer would likely sue for breach of contract, that I would face legal fees that could devastate my savings, that the smarter move was to let the sale proceed and take my share. When I asked him to define what share he had in mind for me, given that it was entirely my property he had been selling, his composure slipped. "You are going to lose this house one way or another," he said. His voice had dropped into something quieter and more deliberate. "The county attorney isn't going to pursue this. Do you know how many of these referrals they get? They file them away. Your lawyer is going to cost you $40,000, and that buyer isn't going away. You are an old woman living alone in a house worth $2 million, and every day you fight this, you're burning through whatever you've got left." Lindsay, behind him, said, "Mom, just please listen to him." I looked at my daughter. I thought about all the years I had loved her and all the ways that love had been, apparently, insufficient armor against the man standing next to her. And I said very quietly, "Lindsay, I hope one day you understand what he's been doing. Not to me, to both of us." She looked away. I stood up from the rocking chair. I was not tall. I never had been. But I stood up straight, the way my own mother had taught me, and I looked at Derek Collins and I said, "I would like you both to leave my property now. Any further communication should go through my attorney, Stephen Morrow. You have his contact information because he sent you a letter this week." Derek stared at me for a long moment. His jaw was tight. Then he turned and walked back down the porch steps, and Lindsay followed him without looking at me. The car backed out of the driveway with more speed than necessary. I sat back down in the rocking chair. My hands were shaking very slightly, which I had not allowed myself to notice while they were standing in front of me. The shaking lasted about 3 minutes. Then it stopped. I called Stephen and told him about the visit. He said I had done exactly right, and that Derek's attempt to contact me directly while litigation was pending was noted and would be documented. Then he told me to rest. He said there was nothing for me to do in the next few days except let the legal process move, and that wearing myself out with worry would not help any of it. I took his advice. I drove up to Sedona on Sunday morning, a drive I had made with Tom every spring for 20 years. And I stayed 2 nights at a small motel near Oak Creek, the one with the red porch and the hummingbirds at the feeder outside the window. I hiked Cathedral Rock to the first plateau, which took me longer than it once had, and sat on a warm sandstone shelf and watched the hawks circling below the rim. It was the first time in 2 weeks I had breathed without measuring it. I came home from Sedona on Tuesday morning. The tomatoes needed water, and the roses along the front walk had opened 3 new blooms while I was gone. A pale yellow variety Tom had called Peace, which he'd planted the year our youngest was born. I stood on the porch for a moment before going inside, looking at my house the way you look at something you almost lost, and I thought, not a chance. There was a voicemail on my landline. I still had a landline. Tom had always said cell signals were unreliable in a storm, from a number I didn't recognize. When I played it, a man's voice introduced himself as Gary Perella, a representative from Meridian Residential, LLC. He said he understood there had been some confusion around the title of the property, and that Meridian was very interested in resolving the situation directly and amicably. He said Meridian was prepared to offer me a generous cash settlement in exchange for withdrawing the Ellis pendants. He used the phrase, generous cash settlement twice, which told me it was not, in fact, particularly generous, and that he was reading from a script someone else had written. I wrote down Gary Perella's number. Then I called Stephen. Stephen said exactly what I had expected him to say. Meridian's attempt to contact me directly while the Ellis pendants was on record and litigation was pending was legally aggressive and strategically foolish. They were either poorly advised or panicking. He said not to call Gary Perella back. He said he would handle it. "What does it mean that they're reaching out?" I asked. "It means the Lice pendants is working," Stephen said. "It means the buyer's investors are getting nervous. A clouded title is worthless to a development company. They can't build, can't sell, can't finance against it. Every week this sits unresolved costs them money." I thanked him and hung up. I made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Derek had laid out his fake documents 3 weeks earlier, and I let myself feel something I hadn't quite allowed yet. I let myself feel that I was winning. It was careful, that feeling. I didn't let it become overconfidence, but I let it be real. The unexpected support came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Ruth had mentioned my situation, with my permission and without names initially, to a group she had been part of for several years, a gathering of women, mostly in their 60s and 70s, who met twice a month at the library on Southern Avenue. They had started as a book club and gradually become something harder to categorize. The kind of group that forms when women who have lived long enough realize they have more practical use for each other than for a curated reading list. Ruth called it the Thursday Group. They called themselves, with some irony, the Silver Foxes. Ruth asked if I would come to the next meeting and tell my story. I almost said no. I am a private person. Tom was more the talker. And the idea of sitting in a circle of strangers and describing what Derek had done made something in me want to retreat. But Ruth said, "Marjorie, there are 11 women in that room. I will bet you 7 of them have a story that rhymes with yours in some way." And because Ruth has been right about most things for 24 years, I said yes. The meeting was on a Thursday evening in late March, in a side room at the library that smelled of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner, which I found entirely comforting. I told my story without dramatizing it, the way I had told Stephen, just the facts in order, what I knew and when I knew it, and what I had done about it. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then a woman named Cecilia, who looked to be about 75 and had the kind of face that had clearly weathered a great deal and come out determined, said, "My son-in-law tried something similar 3 years ago. Different method, same idea. Thought I didn't understand my own finances." She paused. "He underestimated me, too." She said it without triumph. She said it as a statement of plain fact. 2 other women in the room nodded in ways that meant more than agreement with an anecdote. By the end of the evening, I had 3 phone numbers from women who had navigated legal and financial battles with family members and come through the other side. One recommendation for an expert witness who specialized in document forgery for civil cases, and something I hadn't known I was missing: the specific grounding solidarity of being believed by people who understood exactly what kind of war was being waged and why. And I drove home at 9 o'clock under a sky full of stars, and I thought, Derek Collins has never once in his life been underestimated, and I have been underestimated every day of mine. That is not a disadvantage. That is an edge. They came on a Wednesday. This time Lindsay called first, which was new, and her voice had a softness I recognized as performance. I had been her mother for 44 years, and I knew the difference between her genuine softness and the version she deployed when she wanted something. She said Derek felt terrible about how their last visit had gone. She said they wanted to come over, just to talk. No pressure, no lawyers, just family. She said the word family 3 times in 4 sentences. I said they were welcome to come for coffee at 10. I called Stephen immediately after. He said I was not legally obligated to see them, but that if I chose to, I should not agree to anything, sign anything, or make any verbal commitments, and that I should record the conversation if I felt comfortable doing so. Arizona is a one-party consent state. I set my phone behind the fruit bowl before they arrived, recorder running, face down. Then I sat at the kitchen table and waited, which is its own kind of preparation. Derek came in looking humbled, which on him was like a coat that didn't fit. He shook my hand, which he had never done in 8 years of marriage to my daughter. Lindsay poured her own coffee and looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone who had not been home in a long time. She touched the counter near the window, the spot where Tom used to leave his keys, and something moved across her face that I chose not to examine. Derek began. He said he could see, in retrospect, that he had gone about things the wrong way. He said he'd been trying to protect me from the burden of managing a property this size. Taxes, maintenance, liability, and that his intentions had been good even if his methods had been imperfect. He used that word carefully, the way a person selects a word specifically for its smallness. He said he should have come to me first, openly, as family. He was sorry about that. He had practiced being sorry, and he had done a competent job of it. And then, with the apology still warm on the table, he made his pivot. He said Meridian was prepared to offer me $400,000 in cash if I would withdraw the lease pendants and allow the escrow to proceed. $400,000 delivered to my account within 10 days of closing. He said it was more money than I could realistically spend in the remaining years of my life. He said, and here his voice took on the texture of barely concealed contempt, that the legal process I had started would drag on for 2 or 3 years, cost me everything I had saved, and end with me owning a house I couldn't maintain on a fixed income in a neighborhood changing around me anyway. You could have $400,000 and a fresh start, he said, or you could have a lawsuit. He leaned forward, dropping his voice into something meant to sound confidential. He said a financial planner had done some numbers and that a woman my age, with $400,000 in liquid assets, could live very comfortably in a managed community. He said those words the way people say them when they mean somewhere out of the way. The house needed a new roof within 5 years. The electrical panel was outdated. Association fees were going up. He had done his research, or pretended to, which amounted to the same performance. I noticed he never once looked at the garden through the window. Tom's garden. The roses along the fence. He had looked at this property 100 times and never once seen it as a place someone lived and loved. He had only ever seen it as a number. Lindsay looked at me across the table. Her eyes were doing something complicated, something that might have been a warning or an apology or both. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. I thought about Cecilia at the Thursday group. I thought about Stephen's voice, steady and unhurried. I thought about Tom's reading chair and the peace roses along the front walk and the warm sandstone in Sedona. And I thought, you are offering me $400,000 for a house worth $1.8 million that is legally and entirely mine. That is not a settlement. That is an insult with a dollar sign on it. Derek, I said, I appreciate you coming. My answer is no. It will continue to be no. If you have a formal offer to make, please make it through Stephen Morrow. The humility left his face the way weather leaves, all at once, cleanly, with nothing underneath it. What was left was a cold, assessing anger that had probably always been there, waiting. He looked around the kitchen, doing the arithmetic of loss. The number $1.8 million was moving behind his eyes like a tide going out. You are making a very serious mistake, he said. I've heard that before, I said, from you in this room. He stood up. Lindsay stood up. She didn't look at me as she followed him to the door, and the not looking was its own kind of answer. At the threshold, Derek stopped for a moment with his hand on the frame, the pause of a man deciding whether there was one more thing to say that might yet change the outcome. He decided there wasn't. The door closed. The car left. The kitchen was very quiet. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to. I would be lying if I said Derek Collins in the moment the mask came off did not frighten me, not physically, but in the way a person frightens you when you see they are genuinely willing to do damage, that there is no floor beneath their willingness, that what restrains them is not conscience, but calculation. He had come hoping to buy me out cheaply. He was leaving with nothing, and people losing that much money are not finished. They are merely regrouping. I sat with that fear for 5 minutes. I let it be real, and then I let it do what fear properly does. I let it tell me exactly how seriously I needed to take what was coming, and I let it make me harder. I picked up my phone, stopped the recording, and called Stephen. "They came," I said. "You'll want to hear this." The recording changed things. Stephen listened to it twice, and when he called me back, his voice had an edge of quiet satisfaction that was the most emotion I had ever heard from him. He said Derek's statement about the $400,000 offer, combined with his reference to having spoken to Meridian's attorney while criminal proceedings were pending, amounted to what could reasonably be characterized as witness tampering and an attempt to obstruct a legal process. He said he was forwarding the recording to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office that evening. 2 days later, Derek was contacted by a detective. Her name was Carla Briggs, and she worked financial crimes for the county. Ruth knew of her by reputation. Thorough was the word Ruth used, with the specific emphasis of someone who had watched thorough people work and knew what it meant. Detective Briggs had spent 3 weeks by then building the evidentiary file that Stephen had provided: the forged deed, the recorder's filings, the fraudulent trust documents, the photo I had taken of the fake paperwork in my kitchen, and now the recording. She reached out to Derek through his attorney, who was by all accounts not pleased with the position his client was in. Derek requested that any formal interview be conducted with his counsel present, which was his right. But what he didn't account for, what his attorney apparently didn't fully prepare him for, was that Detective Briggs also wanted to speak with the notary, whose stamp appeared on the forged special warranty deed. That notary, a woman named Priscilla Vance who worked at a UPS store in Chandler, had no idea her stamp had been used on the document. She came forward immediately, confirmed she had never notarized any deed involving a Marjorie Hayes, and provided her own records showing no such transaction in her log. A forged notary stamp. Stephen said that, in terms of documentary fraud, this was about as definitive as evidence gets. The formal proceeding was a deposition, not a courtroom. Stephen had pushed for it as part of the civil suit, and Derek's attorney had agreed, apparently believing Derek could manage it. It was held in a conference room at Stephen's firm, a plain room with a long table and windows overlooking a parking lot. I was present. Detective Briggs was present as an observer. A court reporter sat at the end of the table with her machine. Derek arrived in a suit I had never seen before, new or recently dry cleaned, with his attorney, a thin man named Gareth, who kept his hands flat on the table in front of him like he was bracing for something. Derek looked at me when he came in and then looked away, which told me everything I needed to know about his level of confidence. Stephen was methodical. He began with basic facts, dates, documents, the chain of events as it existed in the public record. Derek answered steadily at first. He had a story, and he had practiced it. The trust had been his idea, yes, but Marjorie had agreed to it verbally. The deed had been prepared by a real estate attorney, he said, someone he knew. He couldn't remember the attorney's name offhand. He had understood Marjorie to be on board with the general direction of things. And then Stephen placed the forged deed on the table and asked Derek to look at the signature. "Mr. Collins, is this your wife's mother's signature?" Derek looked at it. "It appears to be," he said. "And can you tell me who witnessed this signature?" "I believe she signed it in the presence of the notary whose stamp appears at the bottom." "Mr. Collins, we have a sworn statement from Priscilla Vance, the notary whose stamp appears on this document, in which she states unequivocally that she never notarized this deed and that her log contains no record of this transaction. I also have the forensic analysis of the signature itself, conducted by a document examiner, which concludes with high probability that the signature is not consistent with samples of Marjorie Hayes's known handwriting. Given those two facts, can you explain to me how this signature came to appear on this deed?" The room was very quiet. Derek looked at his attorney. Gareth gave him nothing, just those flat hands on the table. There may have been an intermediary," Derek said. "Someone who handled the paperwork." "An intermediary," Stephen said. "Can you name this person?" I'd need to look through my files." "You've had 3 weeks to review your files since this litigation was filed, Mr. Collins. You've had the document in question in your possession for 14 months, given that you filed it with the recorder's office yourself. Can you name the intermediary or not?" Derek Collins, who had sat at my kitchen table with his leather folder and his borrowed vocabulary and his certainty that a 72-year-old woman with a garden would simply fold, Derek Collins opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the window. "I need to speak with my attorney," he said. "We'll take a short break," Gareth said immediately, standing up. But it was too late for breaks. The court reporter's machine had captured every word. I sat across the table and watched Derek Collins look for a floor beneath himself and find none. And I thought of something Tom used to say, in his plain contractor's way, whenever he caught someone cutting corners on a job. It always shows up in the inspection. I kept my face entirely neutral. I had been keeping it neutral for 7 weeks. I could manage another hour. Derek's attorney called for a recess, and they were in the hall for nearly 40 minutes. When they came back, Gareth spoke rather than Derek, which was, by that point, the only sensible decision anyone in Derek's camp had made. He said his client wished to discuss the possibility of a negotiated resolution to the civil matter. Stephen said any resolution would need to include full withdrawal of all fraudulently filed documents, restoration of clear title to my name, and a complete accounting of any proceeds already received or committed from the prospective buyer. He also said, and I watched Derek's face as he said it, that the criminal referral was not within Stephen's power to withdraw, as it had been made by me and was now in the hands of the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Whatever Derek chose to do about the civil matter had no bearing on the criminal investigation. Derek looked, for the first time in my experience of him, like a man who did not know what to say. The civil resolution came together over the following 3 weeks. The fraudulently filed special warranty deed was formally revoked and stricken from the county record. A corrective deed was filed, recording 14 Sycamore Hill unambiguously in my name alone. The purchase and sale agreement between the Fraudulent Trust and Meridian Residential, LLC, was voided. Meridian had, by then, quietly withdrawn, their attorneys having concluded that no title insurance company in the state would touch a property with this history. Derek signed a civil settlement agreement acknowledging that he had caused the wrongful filing of documents against my property and agreeing to pay my legal fees in full, which amounted to $38,000. The criminal matter moved more slowly, as criminal matters do, but it moved. Detective Briggs presented her findings to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office in April. Based on the forged deed, the fraudulent notary stamp, the recorded conversation in my kitchen in which Derek described a sale he had arranged without my knowledge or consent, and the deposition testimony in which he could not account for the signature on the document he had filed, the county attorney charged Derek L. Collins with 1 count of fraudulent schemes and artifices under ARS Section 13-2310, 1 count of forgery under ARS Section 13-2002, and 1 count of fraudulent filing of public records. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement. Derek pled guilty to the forgery count and the fraudulent filing count, with the schemes charge dropped in exchange. He was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, a permanent entry on his criminal record, and the loss of his Arizona real estate license. He would never work in commercial real estate in this state again. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I sat in the 3rd row with Ruth on one side of me and Stephen on the other. When the judge read the sentence, I did not feel triumph. Not exactly. I felt something quieter and more durable, the specific satisfaction of a thing being made right that had been made wrong. Justice is not dramatic in my experience. It is procedural and slow and unglamorous, and it often requires you to sit in fluorescent-lit rooms reading documents for hours. But when it arrives, it is solid. You can put your weight on it. Lindsay was not in the courtroom. I had not spoken to my daughter since the Wednesday morning she had walked out of my kitchen behind her husband without looking at me. She had called once in February and left a voicemail that was mostly silence, and then her voice saying, "I don't know what to say, Mom." I had not called her back. Not yet. Perhaps someday. But some repairs require the damaged party to choose the timing, and I was not ready. I walked out of the courthouse into a bright April morning and stood on the steps for a moment. Ruth said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. "I feel like I want to go home and water my tomatoes," I said. She laughed and we went. The summer that followed was one of the quieter and better ones I can remember. I hired a landscaper named Marco to help with the heavier garden work. Not because I couldn't do it, but because Tom had always said you should ask for help with the things that aren't worth injuring yourself over, and the raised beds in the back needed new framing that was beyond what I wanted to manage alone. Marco was 26 and serious about soil composition in a way I found genuinely interesting. We spent several afternoons redesigning the vegetable beds, and by August I had the best tomato harvest I'd had in a decade. Stephen Morrow sent me a card in June. On the inside, he had written only, "Title clear. House yours. Well done." I put it in the fireproof box. Ruth and I continued having lunch on Thursdays at the diner on Central, and I continued going to the Silver Foxes, which had become one of the more useful and honest social arrangements of my later life. In September, Cecilia, the woman whose son-in-law had tried his own version of what Derek had tried, asked if I would be willing to speak to a group she was organizing for older homeowners about property fraud and elder financial abuse. I said yes. I spoke to 14 people in a community room in Mesa on a Wednesday evening, and I told them to keep their deeds in a fireproof box, to check the county recorder's records on their property once a year, to never sign anything they hadn't read twice, and to understand that the people most likely to defraud them were the people who believed they loved them. 3 people came up to me afterward with questions about their own situations. I gave them Stephen's card. As for Derek and Lindsay, I know what I know, which is limited, and I will report it without embellishment. Derek's guilty plea and criminal record meant the end of his real estate career in Arizona as a practical matter. His license was revoked. The plea agreement required him to comply with probation terms, including regular check-ins and financial disclosure requirements, which limited his ability to conduct any business involving property or large financial transactions. I have heard, through the ordinary indirect channels by which information moves in a city, that he and Lindsay moved to his brother's place in Nevada sometime around the fall. I don't know the specifics of their finances. I know that the $38,000 he paid in my legal fees was real money to them, given what I later learned about the state of their accounts. Lindsay called me in October. This time I answered. We talked for a long time. It was not an easy conversation. She said things I had needed to hear for a long time, and I said things she needed to hear, and neither of us pretended that what had happened could be undone or fully explained. I am her mother, and I will not stop being her mother. But I told her plainly, I loved her, and I would not let love be used against me, and if she chose to build a life with Derek Collins going forward, that was her choice to make as an adult, and I would have to make my own choices accordingly. She cried. So did I. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years. By the time the peace roses came back the following April, pale yellow, faithful as always, the house on Sycamore Hill felt like mine again in every sense that mattered. Not just legally, not just on paper. Mine in the sense of a place you have defended and chosen and earned back, which is a different and deeper kind of ownership than the one you inherit or purchase. I sat on the porch on a warm April morning with my coffee, watching Marco work in the back garden, listening to the birds in Tom's elm, and I thought, this is what I was fighting for. Not to win, to stay. That seemed like enough. More than enough, actually. It seemed like everything. Here is what I learned. Your name on a document is not a small thing. Your home is not a passive object waiting to be managed by someone younger or louder. And the people who count on you to be confused are counting on something that is yours to deny them. If someone had handed you those fake documents and told you you'd be living in your car, what would you have done? I'd love to know. Leave it in the comments. And thank you, genuinely, for listening to my story.